Today we are going to be discussing the history of somebody that I knew only as the founder of SE Bicycles. But boy, I had no idea how important this guy was to not only sports that I love, but essentially every extreme sport that we all grew to love, especially if you're a 90s kid. I did in fact start this video as a history of SE Bicycles, but once I started diving into this man's story, I felt like he kind of deserved more of his own video and a history of than the SE Bicycles portion. Scott with one T is considered one of the founders of BMX, but unlike Skip Hess of Mongoose or Gary Turner of GT, Scott was one of the designers of the modern BMX race scene, among many other accolades. In 1957, Scott came into the world in Long Beach, California, and in 1970, when Scott was barely a teenager, one of the first ever BMX races would be held. I used to race motocross. When I practiced, local kids would come out and imitate my jumps. One day I went home, got some of my motorcycle trophies, and had the 35 kids there each pitch in a quarter, broke them down into skill classes, beginner, novice, and expert. It was cool. And the next week, 150 kids showed up. I just want you to think about that. This is long before BMX had a governing body, rules, any of that. The acronym BMX wasn't even a thing. Scott took his racing knowledge from motorcycles and motocross racing and literally made bicycle motocross, BMX. The first track they raced on was literally a motocross course that Scott used for practice. It was a far cry from what modern tracks look like today. It had a 35-foot high drop-away jump, a mud hole, and 8 or 9 other jumps. It was designed for motocross, not for bicycles. This new form of bicycle racing spread like wildfire, and in my opinion that is partially because bicycles were much more accessible than motocross bikes. And in just 4 years, by 1974, Scott had a growing BMX empire, and he is still a teenager at this point. At first, it was 100 to 150 racers a week, then it grew from there. I built new tracks all over. By 1974, I promoted the Yamaha Bicycle Gold Cup Series and had over 1,000 riders at each event. We held the finals in the LA Coliseum. About 16,000 spectators were there. Probably the biggest event ever to this day. It was huge. In the 70s, a BMX race with, let me read that again, 16,000 spectators? Worlds just happened right down the road at the Rock Hill Velodrome, and there was not that many people. During this time, Scott created BUMS, Bicycle United Motocross Society.
BUMS stood for Bicycle United Motocross Society. I had to have some formal name because initially we were just a group of kids in the field where bums came to sleep.
The acronym actually came first, as that was the name of the practice track Scott used when he was racing for Yamaha. BUMS was essentially the first proto-BMX association. Scott created the rulebook, made membership cards, t-shirts, and had a ton of tracks that all adhered to the rule set. This meant that by 1972, BUMS held its first national championships. I want you to think about this. Scott is still a teenager at this point and has created an entirely new sport that is taking off like nicotine in the 60s. I can't even think of something to compare this to in our modern age. Maybe pickleball, like that seems to be growing quickly, but that's a whole nother tangent. It just looks like mini tennis to me. I don't get pickleball, whatever. In 1976 though, the first true national series was started by the NBA, the National Bicycle Association. The Grand Nationals were in SoCal at the Orange County Fairgrounds. I took the overall #1 title on my trusty FMF team replica. Perry Kramer, remember that name, was second. Jeff Utterback, also on FMF, was third overall, and the #1 amateur. It was awesome. Cool little tidbit of info, Scott was actually in the films on Any Sunday 1 and 2. They were a huge influence on everyone in and around this scene at the time. Scott went on to set the jumping distance world record on a BMX bike around this time. 3 jumps with an average distance of 76 feet. He claimed he had a downhill run with 46.13 gearing and was hitting top speeds close to 60 miles an hour. So needless to say, this is when BMX was skyrocketing, Scott was capitalizing, and he was promoting more the sport of BMX than even the bicycles themselves. Because if you get more kids into the sport, you're going to sell more product. In 1977, Scott officially started SE Racing. He first started it as an ad agency and public relations firm. His celebrity status within the BMX world took off after his '76 national title win atop an FMF frame. There were a ton of sponsors vying for his time, and Scott figured he could also market himself along with BMX racing. If the sport grew, his business would grow as a result. Sponsors essentially sent Scott on tour to promote their product, to promote this new racing venture, and to do safety clinics. Because apparently injuries were super high at the time because every kid idolized Evel Knievel and was trying to emulate him without wearing any protective gear. So it's not as bad as it is now, but at the time BMX was starting to get slightly this dangerous rap, and a lot of these companies that were sponsoring Scott wanted to kind of do this safety clinic, get parents on board with letting their kids race BMX.
In my mind, I thought it was going to be, when he said he had a bus and it's going to be all tricked out, I thought this was going to be cool. It's going to be like a Greyhound bus or something semi-plush. It turned out to be this beat-up, tore-up old school bus. So that was the beginning of a legendary tour for us.
The team of SE-sponsored athletes was huge, including names like Bob Harrow, Kevin McNeil, Stu Thompson, Greg Hill, Jeff Utterback, Eddie King, and even more people. These tours they did were a big influence on the younger generation. And come to think of it, I know I'm very out of the loop when it comes to modern day BMX racing, but I'm not sure they do this anymore. I remember going to a place called Hang Loose Skate Park as a kid, just to meet Dave Mira, rest in peace, and Ryan Nyquist. They were literally doing a tour of the US at the time, promoting themselves and their sponsors. I'm just kind of curious, like, is this even still a thing? Or is most of the marketing just gone the way of social media? Because that is still a big day in my brain. Like, I got to meet two of my idols when I was not 10 years old at the time. And they were both super cool. Scott was a very hands-on guy and really wanted to make the best race bike there was. In my opinion, when talking about the founders of BMX, Scott was one of the top racers that also designed and made his own bikes. It was hard to produce frames in the 70s, and a lot of the early frames and products came out of motorcycle shops, which means that a lot of early frames had designs inspired by motorcycles that really didn't make a lot of sense in the world of BMX racing. That same year, he started work on the now infamous PK Ripper, which, if you own an original, they're worth a lot of money now. The PK stood for Perry Kramer, who we talked about earlier. What made the bike so interesting is that Scott was working with alloy materials at the time instead of the traditional steel. This scared a lot of big manufacturers away from his product, but with a lot of trial and error, Scott introduced the Floval tube shaping. Named this because of flat oval. You know, Floval.
What's squishy, stretchy, and transforms almost anything?
Floval. By '78, SE Racing became a full-blown corporation with back orders for frames approaching the 2000s, and a lot of those big manufacturers were scrambling to try and jump on the alloy craze. Scott also introduced the world to the cruiser class, where you would race bigger wheels than the traditional 20-inch race frames. This led to the introduction of the OM Flyer, which quickly became the most popular in the cruiser class. The OM actually came from Scott's nickname, which was Old Man, even though he wasn't that old at the time. He was just older than the up-and-coming generation of BMX kids. Like, when he was really blowing up in popularity, he was like 19-ish, like at his peak, I think he was like 19, 20, and a lot of your up-and-coming really good racers were, like 15, 16-year-olds. So he was the old man, even though he wasn't even 21 yet. I could go on about the awesome bikes that came from SE in the early days. The Mini Ripper, the Junior Ripper, the Assassin, Mauler, Hauler, but we've got some more history to get to. Mike Devitt was a bit of mentor for Scott when he started SE Racing. When I started SE Racing, Mike consulted with me for a few years, and I made Mike an offer to join me at SE full-time. And in 1980, we created Scott Industries by buying our contracted manufacturing plants, brought our production in-house, and SE grew at an incredible rate. We've been together ever since, and we are still best friends. Quick recap, SE started as more of a marketing PR firm for Scott to build up this BMX race scene, and now in the early 80s, it is a full-blown in-house bicycle production company. At this point, SE is rising at a pretty steady rate, and something you will learn about Scott is that he is a business startup man above all else. He learned how to be an entrepreneur at a young age, and his passion really seemed to be building a successful company and then selling it. Scott started to focus on growing more than just BMX racing. BMX will always be in his blood, but he saw an opportunity to bring more obscure sports to the masses as well. If being a founding father of BMX wasn't enough, he is also a founding father of televising extreme sports, such as BMX, skateboarding, go-karts, MMA, snowboarding, mountain biking, and just extreme sports in general. All the obscure ones that were never on television really before Scott started pushing these things. Scott was also one of the first staff writers for Bicycle Motocross magazine and the co-founder of BMX Plus. He helped produce the first TV production of BMX racing, distributed internationally. It was the 1987 IBM XF World Championships from Orlando, Florida. It was on tons of networks: Nickelodeon, HNK, Star, TSN, BSN, and others through his cable syndication of over 60 million homes.
With America's finest are here.
And we're going to see America's finest take on the world at the IBM XF World Championships on Nickelodeon.
He was also involved with the first mountain bike TV program, the 1988 Swatch World Championships from Mammoth Mountain Resort, distributed through ESPN and other international networks.
Bike in an accident, but still came up and competed. Here he's borrowed John Tomac's bike. The bike was grabbed in a sandy berm. Bell goes on to qualify to the round of 16. Dave Cullinan, fast lap qualifier, is eliminated.
Welcome to Mammoth Mountain, California, and the Swatch World Mountain Bike Championship. David Stanfield with Scott Breithoff. Round number 2, the dual challenge, Scott.
Out of the gate, we've got riders black.
He was involved with the first BMX freestyle TV show with ESPN. It was the 1987 AFA SACO Finals. To look that one up. So not only did Scott bring BMX as a sport to the masses, he did this for other sports as well. How could we have the current iteration of the X Games if it wasn't for Scott bringing BMX, snowboarding, mountain biking to my generation of kids watching Nickelodeon? Scott lost the rights to the SE Bicycles name to an overseas company in 1999 and went on to more or less manage money. So before Scott hit puberty, he was already building up this empire. He was making BMX racing. I mean, think about that. You had Evel Knievel before him that was really, I would say, maybe the root of the mass hysteria for extreme sports or stunts, that kind of stuff. Then whenever Scott came along, he kind of really revolutionized BMX bikes, obviously, because he's the one that started BMX racing. I'm sure there might have been somebody else doing some form of BMX racing, but everything I've researched and looked at, everyone points to him as having like the first real BMX series in that Bums. He created the first rules, all of that. Without him, we might have a completely different take on BMX racing, and maybe it would be more of a novelty thing, like those dirt scooters from Mongoose that never really seemed to take off, but were just pretty cool. And to me, I think what happened was, because Scott just continuously one-upped himself with advertising and getting BMX racing to the masses, to bigger audiences, he inevitably wanted to get it televised. And with getting it televised, he also saw all these other obscure sports that didn't have representation on networks, and he thought, if he can bring all these niche sports to the masses, maybe they're going to catch like wildfire, and there's going to be other sports that he can help build up as well. That's also going to help his bottom line. But before this man, there was no real off-road bike racing in the US. Hell, mountain bike racing and bikes for that matter were initially based and influenced by BMX bikes and racing. So without Scott, mountain bike racing may look entirely different right now. He brought and marketed these things to so many kids, and I am forever grateful. But we will end this episode here because Scott has a much deeper history I'd like to discuss with you. Not only did he inspire a lot of people, but he also showed us how important the issue of drug addiction is in our modern society. Stay tuned for the next video. This is going to be one of my first kind of multi-part series. I think I'm going to be able to chalk it up into 2. We're going to cover more of Scott's life in the next one. I thank you all for watching. If you made it this far, please like, subscribe, hit the bell notification button so you know when that next video does come out. All of that helps, but I appreciate each and every one of you. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.